Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell. We're back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have American company Flat River Group is shutting down their Greater Than Games division because of Trump's tariffs from ICV2.com, posted by Plasman30, and they added, "Good job, Trump." And yeah, personally, I definitely do think, this is a consequence of tariffs, a lot of small businesses who might need to get materials from foreign countries might not be able to operate anymore. But that's how the world works sometimes. I guess I personally am not a fan of the tariffs. I'm against all forms of taxation, and tariffs are simply a tax on imported goods. But with that being said, the state has the monopoly on the legal use of force to enforce any legal or to enforce any policies they want to, and that does include economic policies. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have that has escalated quickly from Bragner OKXG, and that's crosspost from the Murdered by Words subreddit, and it's a tweet from CNN. President Trump says Russia should be allowed back into the G7, and they linked to the article on that, I guess. And then Rep. John Yarmouth says, "Say what you will about Trump, he sure is loyal to the country that elected him." And yeah, I think I guess that's supposed to be like kind of like shit lib bingo. Russia, is kind of the free space when it comes to shit lib bingo these days. They always say Trump, Russia, Russia, Russia. They've been pushing Trump's a Russian asset for almost a decade now. And yeah, if you want to think Trump's Russian asset, that's fine. But it's just kind of just blaming. It's like just blame. You can't just blame Russia for all your problems. That's what the Democrats think they can do. They can just blame Russia or like Jill Stein for taking votes away from them. But they need to take. It just goes to show you that they can't. That they always have someone to blame instead of taking personal responsibility. And yeah, I personally think if you want to think Trump's Russian asset, that's fine. But you've been yelling Russia, Russia, Russia for a decade now, and it's pretty much just your equivalent of like the Jewish conspiracy, only instead of Jews, it's the Russians run everything rather than the Jews run everything. And yeah, if you want to say that, that's fine. But it's just another boogeyman for you to use, just like just like how you always say, "Oh, Trump's a Nazi." Eventually people get tired of the same old cliches being said over and over again. But Reddit, they just like to jerk themselves off. It's the same tropes to just jerk themselves off over and over again. And that's why I don't really care for it. But, freedom of speech, they should be able to do it. But I feel like a lot of people these days want to have actual discussion rather than just jerk themselves off. And increasingly, you can't do that on social media. It's all just a giant circle jerk where people will just say the same things over and over again. I said this before. It's all like the Jungle Cruise ride at the Disney parks. It's the same joke. That's when you get on the Jungle Cruise ride. It's the same jokes over and over again, and that's social media for you. It's the same plivy comments over and over again, and it gets tiring after a while. But you just have to put up with it, I guess. And we have FCC chairman goes after Comcast for news distortion after White House complains that MSNBC didn't carry a press briefing on deportations. From Deadline.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, I personally don't really care about. I don't think the government should be telling the media what it can and can't say. I don't really care for MSNBC. They're pretty much DNC Fox News. That's why you might as well call them MS13 DNC rather than MSNBC. But yeah, I don't think the government should be going after the media. I think the libertarian perspective is that the FCC shouldn't exist in the first place. It's just another one of those free letter agencies. And yeah, the libertarian perspective is, the FCC chairman shouldn't be going after Comcast or any of their subsidiaries. They should be allowed to fall on their own merits. Cable news viewership, like the rest of cable, is dying, and I think it's time to just let it die. And you don't need the government to go after it. You just need to let it fail on its own merits. But when people are, you don't want to be an authoritarian, even if MSNBC might be biased against you. They pretty much are very much biased against. You pretty much didn't see Fox News this earlier, but even if it is biased, you just need to let it fail on its own merits. That's freedom of speech. And I really don't care for the corporate legacy alphabet media like MSNBC, but they still should have freedom of speech, and that's my thoughts on that issue. I'd say the same thing if it was. I think all media is free TV, no matter how propagandistic it is. That's why I don't think they should ban Russia Today either. And they try. I think they banned Russia Today in a few countries after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I don't think that's right either. I think all speech is free speech. I think even if it was Nazi German propaganda, it'd still be free speech. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have my thoughts on tariffs from Bird the Word 303. And that's a chart they shared. Economists strongly agree tariffs and import quotas usually reduce general economic welfare. It looks like that was 90% said that in 1990, 90% in 2000, 90% in 2011, 90% in 2021. And they have a huge wall of text. I don't know if I can read all of it, but I'll try and get into it as much as I can. Tariffs are a controversial issue, even amongst conservatives. Some fall into the more libertarian/Reaganite camp against them, including me. Here's my case against protectionism. If prices could be lower in the U.S. and abroad, investors would have already funded such production to undercut and capture market share from foreign competitors. There are simply many goods we're worse on or downright incapable of producing due to climate, geographical capital, and natural resource constraints. That, or it simply isn't worth the opportunity cost of rebuilding all the infrastructure needed when it's readily available abroad. Many constraints are self-imposed, such as regulatory and fiscal burdens and distortions caused via monetary policy. We can and should do away with such restrictions to better attract foreign investment back to our shores, but we in no way should inhibit our ability to trade freely with those who happen to be outside this arbitrary line we call borders. For example, let's say you refuse to trade with anyone outside your house. Do you have everything needed to be self-sufficient, and not only that, to maximize your well-being? No, you just don't. That's why trade exists. It's mutually beneficial to both parties. Tariffs raise production costs for domestic producers, shrinking our productive capacity in sectors whose demand for their products is more inelastic, and it forces them to raise prices to compensate for more expensive inputs. Industries who harbor a greater elasticity to demand for their products are forced to cut back on expenses such as payrolls, thus increasing unemployment since they can't raise prices. This often results in bankruptcy and downsizing for those heavily reliant upon foreign inputs. In some cases, domestic prices rise more than now artificially higher prices of tariff goods. In this scenario, consumers buy imports regardless of tariffs. Everyone's hurt. Consumers are left with higher prices. Domestic industry is still not competitive, and foreigners experience reduced consumption of their efforts. Also, as consumer goods are left more expensive from tariffs, incomes fall in real terms, necessitating more income to make any given venture sufficiently profitable enough to warrant investment. In other words, the incentive to produce is hurt when the goods said producers demand aren't available. Tariffs cost more jobs than they help. Even in the rare few sectors that do see relatively boost from tariffs, their incomes are left lower in real terms. Regardless, we shouldn't desire to artificially prop up inefficient domestic businesses to the detriment of consumers. Everyone, their land, labor, and capital should be freed up for those who are actually effective in satisfying consumer demands, whether they're from here or abroad. As consumers spend less on imports than their corresponding domestic alternatives, that leaves more money in their pockets to be spent elsewhere, boosting employment in other sectors of the economy, thus offsetting any potential loss of employment in said domestic industries due to lacking a competitive edge. Lastly, why does it matter what geographical region employment occurs? Worst case scenario, regardless of tariffs, people will simply move for greater employment opportunities. It's not as they're stuck there against their will, forced to take whatever they're offered. At best, tariffs are an ineffective form of DEI for shitty corporations because behind imaginary borders. At worst, tariffs spark trade wars, often leading to real wars, and hurt the very people it seeks to protect. Terrorists seek to do ourselves in peacetime what enemies do to us in wartime, sanctioning ourselves in the solution to the outsourcing we see today, freeing up our economy to attract them back to our shores. Terrorists are attacks like any other, treat them as such. Now I'll address the alleged balance of trade issue. Trade deficits in and of themselves are neither good nor bad. merely a reflection of the differing time preferences of the citizenry at a given moment in time. Just imagine at the micro level. Let's say you sell $100 worth of apples one day and decide only spend $10 on food for the evening. You're running a trade surplus of $9 from those 24 hours. On every day you earn 100 and spend 200 of your prior servings on desirable consumer/producer goods. You're running a trade deficit of $100 within those 24 hours. Neither of these situations are inherently good or bad. Depends on their goals and financial health. If one only saves and never spends, then what's the point of the currency in possession unless they simply desire to pass it down to their children? Many workaholic owners fall into that camp to their own detriment, but that's their choice. In contrast, if you only ever run trade deficits, then you will be broke, such as an irresponsible teen who wastes all his income and runs down his savings for short-term pleasure at the detriment of the future. Another note to be made is that a trade deficit can lead to a surplus via investment. If foreign savers finance the domestic producer goods, that enables the future production of goods to later be exported, and vice versa. If domestic savers wish to finance the foreign purchasing of producer goods for us to later consume in from abroad, that's a case of present surpluses bring about a healthy deficit in the future. Let's say we're not, especially in a naturally endowed country, we lack the space, human capital, and natural resources to produce practically any given food at a worthwhile price/quality compared to abroad, and they lack an incentive to off-road some of their more undesirable labor onto us for whatever reason. Or one saving grace in that scenario is that we can provide financial intermediaries to the rest of the world, earning interest and dividends in exchange for the efficient allocation of land, labor, and capital. They use said earnings to consume imports. In this case, the deficit is a necessity, as we must import practically everything we wish to consume. In a free market, the balance of trade each year would be different in accordance with society's aggregate time preferences. Some years this may, in general, desire to cash in, resulting in a deficit. Maybe there's a large elderly population running down their net worth to enjoy the rest of their lives in luxury, vice versa. Maybe society's more future-oriented. I'd say I'd trend towards surplus due to an increasing young population with lower time preferences in aggregate due to sound money and deflationary forces, but it's up to the market and results vary each year. Many years the balances of trade may be balanced, exporting the equivalent value we import. One last thing to note is that under scarce money, persistent never-ending trade deficits are impossible. A said country would eventually run out of money. The U.S. is the one exception in this regard due to our global reserve currency status. We print money and buy things abroad. Fine and dandy for us now, but this will inevitably come to bite us in the ass one day as the world moves away from the dollar. And I would agree with all that. It's quite a verbose post. Normally I think the left is more associated with wall of text than the right. But, the right can definitely do a wall of text as well, as this post indicates. But, yeah, I would agree with all that. Trade is not a zero-sum game. If people didn't have to trade, they wouldn't. And I would very much agree with this post. People trade because, that's how economies work. I'm filming this on a smartphone right now. I didn't purchase a smartphone. I bought it from a store, and it's made of all materials that are from all over the world, and it's the same with pretty much everything. And I'm gonna upload this on. This is gonna be uploaded to YouTube if you're watching this far. And it just goes to show you that that's another website. The whole internet as a whole is pretty much a giant communication trade system. Just like the trade system, just like yeah. I don't know. That's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump voter almost died after being detained by border agents from Newsweek.com by Paton 13. They added, Bashir Atala said, I really thought things would change after his administration. When we had Mr. Trump in office, things would change for the better. Things actually changed for the worse. And, yeah, it just goes to show you that, I personally think, Reddit's only posting this because, leopards ate my face. But, it just goes to show you that, it doesn't really matter who's in the White House or who's in the position of power. What matters is the force of the state. And I personally think even if Kamala was the president, those border agents would still probably be going after them if he was down by the border. But, it just goes to show you that, people always make a deal of who's elected to what position. But, I would say in reality, it's the whoever uses the government's force, like the border agents, the soldiers, or the police officers, are arguably much more relevant from the libertarian perspective because the state's legitimacy comes from its monopoly on the use of force, and the border agents, police officers, soldiers, etc., are oftentimes going to be the ones that are exercising that force. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.